What's going on, everybody? Today was a very choppy day. We had two patterns that just kept happening over and over again. We had the volume profile rotations and we had the vertical distributions. We're going to get into both of those patterns and how you could have traded them here in a little bit. Let's take a look at a little snapshot before we get into it. So starting out with a snapshot for the day, we had not really a lot of movement across the board. The bond market was pretty flat. The dollar was pretty flat. The euro, USD, JPY also pretty flat. Bitcoin was down quite a bit, almost like 1.5 to 2%. Ended the day pretty much flat as well at 0%. And then same thing for gold. You were down about 1% on gold. And then ended the day, yeah, you guessed it, flat again. So pretty much flat for all the assets today. ES and NASDAQ did have a decent close. You did bounce a little bit. You ended the day up about 35 points or 0.58% on ES. Still showing buy pressure above those prior highs. So still looking decently bullish for now. But we do have CPI tomorrow. So can't plan for really anything until we see that CPI data coming out. If I had to guess, it's going to be plus or minus 50 points, depending on how that data comes out. So probably around 6,100 or a little bit below 6,000. But like I said, we won't plan too much. We'll see how that data comes out at 8:30. Let's take a look at NASDAQ as well. NASDAQ also closed up 0.65%, 141 points to the upside. I think for NASDAQ, you're going to have plus or minus 100 points, depending on CPI. And that's just kind of a guess based on current volatility. I don't actually really know what we are looking for. But if I had to guess, I would say up 100 points on a good CPI, down 100 points on a bad CPI. And could be even more than that, probably about 150 on NASDAQ with that volatility. Okay, so what did we see today? Today was a bunch of rotations, just kind of back and forth for the start of the day. We are rotating a little bit outside of yesterday's value. So yesterday's value would be right here. We had the value high and the value low there. And this is where today's cash profile opened up, tried to push up, retested yesterday's value, and then closed a little bit higher. So on the higher time frames, if we didn't have CPI tomorrow, I would say this is pretty damn bullish, because we have a very large overlapping value that we broke out of, we retested, and we showed buy pressure off of that retest. So overall, I would say it's pretty bullish, but unfortunately, we have to wait and see how that CPI data comes out. We were able to hit our 45 target. We did not get a breakout into our 70 target. NASDAQ, pretty much the same story here. We had a bunch of rotations around yesterday's value, just kind of chopping around. We finally were able to break, retest, and push again away from that overlapping value. Same thing we talked about on ES. So looking pretty decent. Once again, CPI tomorrow. So if CPI is bullish, that will confirm that overlapping value is acting as support. Okay, let's take a look at our order flow and see how we could have traded today. So today, for the most part, going into like 10 to 10:30, you were just looking for those rotations, and it was leaning slightly bullish into the value high. So what kept happening today, we talked about this on the live stream, is you kept bouncing off VWAP, this dotted line right here, as your value low. So instead of going all the way back down to the full session value low, the cash value low was basically where that VWAP is. So you kept bouncing off that VWAP as if it was the value low, and then going back to your value high, which around the morning was, I think, if I remember correctly, it was like 22. So you kept hitting VWAP 22, VWAP 22, VWAP 22. Then finally around, I would say 10:20, we started pushing outside of that value high, and we tried to hold above that value high as a support, which it almost did. It almost held that and started to break until there was a headline that came out. I can't remember off the top of my head what that headline was, but there was a headline that came out. It shot down, and and then we bounced off the value low of yesterday. And if I remember correctly, what was that? I think it was 07. Let me double check here. Yeah, 07. So 6,007, which is damn near the bottom. It was right around here. That was the value low of yesterday. So if you were looking for that as a support, once again, trading those rotations, buying the value low, selling the value high, then that would have been a fantastic buy point on that push down. You would have had to be very quick, or you would have had to have your limit orders in place on that value low because it didn't really give you a lot of time down there. I think it gave you, it gave you literally 1 minute. So you had one candle down there before you started to bounce. Now, after that happened, we talked about that rotation going off of that 07 level back to yesterday's value high, which was 22. And then you started slowly breaking out into our trade plan targets, which were 45 and on NASDAQ around 975, and the overnight high, which actually, sorry, that was 975 there. So once we hit that value low, once again, D-shape trade plan, buy the value low, sell the value high. Obviously not blindly, but that's where you're looking for trades. Started to push up, finished the rotation into 22. I think the current day's value high at the time was around the 30 to 33 level, kind of the mid 30s. Then we had this really strong bullish cluster form. This was the strongest cluster of the entire day, and that was around 12 o'clock here. So let me pull that up on the 1 minute so you can kind of see where that was. So that was around like right up here, where we had that really big block trade come in on NASDAQ, some block trades on ES as well, and you can just see how strong that cluster is on that footprint. Traded a few thousand contracts, plus 5,000 on that candle. Then we started talking about this in Discord, where we were looking for these candles. This was in a vertical distribution. When you are in a vertical distribution, there are a couple things you want to look for. You want to look for the 24 EMA on the 1 minute, which is the orange line here. As long as that 24 EMA is being protected, then you can continue to the upside. Even though it's giving you signals that it wants to go down, you can still continue to the upside. It basically ignores the sell signals and just continues to grind higher. Now, the other thing you want to look for is if you have a 30-minute footprint, you want to watch those nodes, those clusters, and make sure on the pullbacks they are being respected. Okay, so we had this cluster going from 32 and a quarter down to 30 even, and that was retested twice here, which gave you two very beautiful pullback buys if you were looking to be a buyer in that cluster area. And that was around, what time was that? That was around 12:30 to 1:30. So that's kind of on this pullback right here. Retesting that 24, bouncing out of it. Same thing here, retesting that cluster and bouncing out of it for that high of day. Then finally, we started breaking the 24 EMA, putting in lower highs and lower lows. So right here, you have a break of structure where you start actually putting in lower lows after a lower high. And after that, you were basically just selling for most of the day until about 3 o'clock, about 2:50. So you started selling down, which funnily enough, once again, you finished that rotation down to 16. So today, like I said, you had two scenarios. You had the rotations and you had the vertical distribution. So you had that rotation down to 16. I'll show you that back here on the 30-minute chart. It was right here on that value low of the full session. So you came back down to 16, bounced off of it, and that rotation goes back up to, I think at the time it was actually a little bit lower. Right now it says 40. I think it was like mid 30s. I think it was like 35. So you started bouncing off that 16. You were looking for that full rotation back to the mid 30s. You started hitting that 35 level right around, I think it was around 3 o'clock. Let me see here. Yeah, it was on this push right here. So that would have finished your rotational trade at around 3 o'clock. After that, you did go for one final push back to the upside, which it actually did have pretty decent buyer delta on the high, but let me show you the problem here. We talked about this in Discord as well. So one of our favorite strategies we've been using for years now, actually, are these afternoon breaks, right? So just to give you an idea what you're looking at here, the white / like gray profile here, that is from 9:30 to 12 o'clock. Basically the morning value. And then the purple profile is from 12 o'clock into the close. That is the afternoon value. Anytime you see a break in the afternoon that breaks above or below the morning value, it typically is always retraced either that same day, which, for example, you can see right there. You see the morning low right here? You break that morning low, you bounce back into the morning low before the close. And you can see that time and time and time again. Right here, we break, retrace, retrace. And you can, like I said, you can just backtest this as much as you want, but it's a very strong pattern. Now, sometimes if you do not retrace on that same day, it wants to retrace it on the following days. So here's a good example of one that was not retraced on that same day. And honestly, it actually didn't get retraced for quite a while. It had to pull all the way back to, 1, 2, 3 trading days later. You pulled back to retest that high, and you didn't even hit it exactly. But usually it's kind of like single prints, where it tries to retrace that same day. If it doesn't do it the same day, it retraces it the following day. All right, sorry, that was a long tangent to explain the afternoon break here. But what I was trying to explain is we had a couple of afternoon breaks here, and we were talking about in Discord how when you have these breaks, you want to pull back to that morning value, which in this case is around 31. So we wanted to see a pullback into 31, and we wanted to close around that 31. So we had the pullback. You can see this pullback here, and then we had this pullback here. That is damn near to the tick. That is on that 31 level almost exactly. Unfortunately, it's been very strong on the imbalances on the close. So the closing imbalances typically happen around 340, 350, and 355. So we had a pretty strong imbalance come in at around 350, and you started having a closing spike into that imbalance. So you didn't quite repair that afternoon break, and I would say we would look for that tomorrow, but the problem is, once again, we have CPI tomorrow, which is an extremely high impact economic data release. It's at 8:30 a.m. Eastern time. I would say if we did not have that economic data, we would look for that pullback either during the pre-market or tomorrow morning. Okay. So that's what we were looking for into that one pullback right here into 330. Once again, testing that same cluster around 6,030. And then we bounced out of that cluster beautifully. Did not hang out on that cluster for very long. And that's where that closing spike came in. So long story short, you needed two patterns to trade today. You needed the vertical distribution pattern, which looks like this, where you have that kind of upwards chop, and you want to watch that 24 EMA as a support, and you want to watch the prior nodes. So if we come back down to retest those prior nodes, you want those to act as support as well. Funnily enough, they typically line up with that 24 EMA. And the other pattern you needed today were the rotations. You needed those D-shape rotations from the value low to the value high. So typically with a volume profile, if you have that bell curve, value high would be somewhere around there, value low would be somewhere around there. It likes to kind of rotate back and forth inside that value area. Okay, so during a D-shaped profile like that, you typically want to look for sells around that value high, look for buys around the value low, until you hold significant value outside of that value area. Okay, which we started to do today around, what time was it? It was around 12 o'clock. We tried to break out of that value. But all right, guys, that is it. Hopefully you guys enjoyed this recap. Hit that like button. Be sure to subscribe, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Peace.